in the unforgiving heart of the Dakota Territory, where promises were as common as dust and just as easily broken, a story was forged that the history books chose to forget. It's not a tale of gunslingers or gold rushes. It's a story about two people discarded by their worlds, left for dead at the end of the line. One a woman judged for the space she occupied, the other a warrior from a dying nation. What happened on the platform of the Promise Creek Station in 1882 was more than an encounter. It was a reckoning, a tale of how a cruel rejection became an unthinkable salvation, and a marriage of desperation became a legend of its own. The journey had stripped away everything but the bone-deep hope that rattled inside Aria Hobbs. For 6 days and 7 nights, the Union Pacific train had been her world, a clattering, soot-stained cocoon, carrying her from the damp, predictable green of Ohio to the vast, terrifying emptiness of the Dakota Territory. She had memorized the face in the daguerreotype until its silvered edges were soft with the friction of her thumb. Mr. Jedediah Stone. His letters were a testament to a firm, pious man. He spoke of building a life, of needing a sturdy, God-fearing woman to make his ranch a home. He owned 200 acres, he wrote a new timber house, and a future as wide as the sky he described. Aria was, if nothing else, sturdy. She was not the delicate corseted beauty whose photograph might grace a locket. She was tall for a woman with broad shoulders, strong hands, and a fullness to her figure that her plain grey travelling dress could not conceal. Back home, whispers of spinster had begun to follow her at 26. The men wanted willowy girls they could encircle with one arm. Aria's prospects had dried up like a creek in a drought. Jedediah Stone's advertisement in the Matrimonial Times was a lifeline. His letters asked for honesty, and she had given it, describing herself as of a hardy constitution, plain in appearance, but a diligent worker. She had enclosed no photograph. It had been her one great gamble. As the train hissed to a stop at the Promise Creek Station, her heart hammered against her ribs. The name itself felt like a good omen. This was it. The platform was a chaotic scrum of humanity, weary travelers, dusty cowboys and hard-faced men from the freight cars. She clutched her single battered valise and descended the steep steps, her eyes scanning the crowd for the man from the picture. She saw him almost immediately. He was leaner than in the photograph, with a severe face browned by the sun and a thin, disapproving mouth. He stood with another man, a portly fellow in a sweat-stained suit who seemed to be the town station master. Jedediah's eyes swept over the disembarking passengers, dismissing them one by one. When his gaze finally fell on Aria, it did not light with recognition or welcome. It narrowed. He took a hesitant step forward, then stopped, his expression curdling from confusion to pure, unvarnished disgust. He walked toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't stop in front of her, but circled her slowly like a rancher inspecting livestock he had no intention of buying. The heat of a dozen pairs of eyes seemed to prickle Aria's skin. The station master, Mr. Gable, shuffled awkwardly behind him. "You Aria Hobbs." Jedediah's voice was a dry rasp, devoid of any warmth. "I am Mr. Stone," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she offered a small, hopeful smile. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you in person." He ignored her hand. The letter said, "Hardy Constitution." It didn't say this. He gestured vaguely at her entire person, a flick of his wrist that carried the weight of a physical blow. "You're a big woman. A fat woman." The words, spoken so plainly and publicly, struck the air from Aria's lungs. The whispers around them grew into audible snickers. Her face, already flushed from the journey, burned with a shame so hot It felt like it might peel her skin away. "I am strong for work, Mr. Stone." She managed to stammer her hope, now a frantic, dying thing. As I wrote, "I can cook and clean and I can help with. I wanted a wife, not a draft horse," he sneered. "I sent $50 for your passage. That was for a bride, a woman to stand beside me in church, not one who'd need her own pew." The station master Gable cleared his throat. "Now, Jedediah, let's be civil. The lady's had a long trip." "This ain't a lady, it's a misrepresentation." Stone shot back, his voice rising. "I paid for goods as described, and these goods are defective. I ain't paying another cent. I ain't taking her." He turned his back on her, a final, brutal act of dismissal. "She can use the return ticket if she has one. Otherwise it ain't my problem." He stalked away without a backward glance, disappearing into the dusty main street of Promise Creek. Arya stood frozen, her valise slipping from her nerveless fingers to land in the dirt with a soft thud. The crowd of onlookers, their curiosity satisfied, began to drift away, leaving her in a bubble of profound, echoing silence. She had no return ticket. The $50 Jedediah had sent had been just enough for the one-way fare and a few meals. She had exactly $1.14 in her coin purse. She was 1,000 miles from a home that no longer wanted her stranded in a town that had witnessed her utter humiliation within minutes of her arrival. She was, for all intents and purposes, nothing, a piece of unwanted freight left on the platform. She didn't notice the man who had been watching the entire exchange from the shadows of the water tower. He had seen the train arrive, an ugly iron snake scarring the land. He watched most days, a silent observer of the white man's bustling, noisy world. He was Lakota, a man whose people had once called this entire prairie home. His name was Chayton, though the few whites who dared speak to him called him Hawk for the intensity of his gaze. He had seen the hope on the woman's face, and he had seen it extinguished by the cruel words of the rancher. He had seen cruelty before. He had seen it at the end of a soldier's rifle and in the ink of a treaty. But this was different. This was a personal, intimate kind of cruelty, and it stirred something in him. He watched as the woman finally sagged her broad shoulders, slumping not in weakness, but under the sheer weight of her desolation. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. The platform at Promise Creek had long since emptied, but Arya Hobbs remained. She had moved to a wooden bench outside the station-master's office, a solitary statue of despair. "Mister," Gable had offered her a glass of water, his face a mask of pity and embarrassment, but she had refused. To accept would be to acknowledge her new status as an object of charity. Her mind was a maelstrom of panic. Every option she considered led to a dead end. She could not go back. She could not stay. The few respectable women in town had averted their eyes as they passed. The cowboys and prospectors who remained gave her looks that were far worse, appraising glances that made her feel like a piece of meat left out for scavengers. She knew with a cold certainty what became of women alone and penniless in towns like this. The saloon, the brothel upstairs? It was a swift downward path. It was then that she felt the presence of someone standing before her. She looked up from her study of the dusty planks at her feet and saw a pair of worn moccasins. Her gaze traveled up past leather-clad legs to a simple cloth shirt, to a face that seemed carved from the very rock of the Badlands. It was the Indian. She had noticed him earlier, a fleeting shape in the shadows. He was tall, with hair as black as a raven's wing, braided and hanging past his shoulders. His face was stark and unreadable, his dark eyes holding a depth she couldn't begin to fathom. He was not like the Sioux she had seen in illustrations back east, not adorned with a feathered war bonnet, but radiating a quiet, powerful stillness that was somehow more intimidating. Fear, sharp and cold, lanced through her. She clutched the handle of her valise, her only worldly possession. He did not speak for a long moment. He simply watched her, his gaze not unkind, but unnervingly direct. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and surprisingly soft, his English accented but clear. "The man," he said, "he is not your husband." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Arya could only shake her head, a tear finally tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "You have no place to go," he stated again. She shook her head once more, unable to find her voice. She expected him to walk away, or worse, to mock her, as the others had. Instead, he took a breath and said the 5 words that would shatter and then remake her entire world. "You will marry me. Today." Arya stared at him, convinced the heat and the grief had made her delirious. He couldn't have said what she thought he'd said. It was impossible. A joke, perhaps. But his face was utterly serious. I don't understand," she whispered. "You need a husband, a place, protection." He explained his words, deliberate and measured. "I have a cabin. I need a wife, to cook, to tend the home. You are strong. You look like you can work." He was echoing Jedediah's requirements, but where Stone's words had been an insult, Chaitan's were a simple, practical assessment. He saw her sturdiness not as a flaw, but as a virtue. The irony was staggering. Her mind reeled. Marry a savage. The thought was terrifying, an act of social suicide. She would be an outcast from the white world entirely. But what was that world offering her now? Pity, contempt, and the fast-approaching threat of a far worse fate. This man, this stranger from a completely different world, was offering her a solution. A brutal, insane, unthinkable solution, but a solution nonetheless. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice a raw croak. "Why me?" Chaitan's eyes drifted for a moment toward the town, toward the saloon, where Jedediah Stone was likely boasting of his discerning taste. "My people say a person left to die in the wilderness should be helped. You have been left in the wilderness." He looked back at her. "And I do not like that man." It was the simplest, most profound explanation she had ever heard. He wasn't offering romance or affection. He was offering an alliance, a partnership born of mutual necessity and a shared contempt for the man who had wronged her. Before she could process it further, the door to the station master's office creaked open. Mr. Gable stepped out, followed by the town sheriff, a man with a drooping mustache and cold, suspicious eyes named Brody. "Mum." Sheriff Brody began his tone, lacking any sympathy. "Mr. Gable here says you're still loitering. You can't stay here. You got plans." Arya opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Chaitan stepped slightly forward, placing himself between her and the 2 men. "She is with me," Chaitan said. Brody's eyes narrowed. "With you, Hawk. What business does a woman like her have with you? She will be my wife." Chaitan stated his voice, flat and devoid of challenge, yet carrying an unshakable finality. A stunned silence fell over the platform. Gable's jaw dropped. Sheriff Brody let out a short, incredulous bark of a laugh. "His wife? Have you gone mad, woman?" Brody said, addressing Arya directly. "You can't marry him. It ain't proper. It ain't even legal without a preacher or a justice of the peace." "Our laws are older than yours," Chaitan said quietly. "We need no paper." Arya looked from the sheriff's sneering face to Chaitan's stoic profile. In that moment, her choice became devastatingly clear. On one side was the law and propriety of the people who had mocked and discarded her. On the other was a man who, for his own reasons, was offering her a shield. It was a choice between a familiar hell and a terrifying unknown. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaking but holding. She looked directly at Sheriff Brody, her voice gaining a sliver of the strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I accept his offer," she said. "I am going with him." Sheriff Brody stared, flabbergasted. "You'll regret this, ma'am. There's no coming back from this." "There is nothing for me to come back to," Arya replied, the truth of it settling into her bones like a winter chill. Chayton gave a slight nod. He bent down, picked up her valise, as if it weighed nothing, and turned. "Come," he said to her. Arya Hobbs took a deep breath, turned her back on the town of Promise Creek, and followed her new husband into the twilight. The journey from Promise Creek was a silent one. Chayton led the way to a single horse, a sturdy buckskin with a patient demeanor tethered behind the livery. He secured her valise, then mounted the horse with fluid grace. He extended a hand down to her. Hesitantly she took it. His grip was firm and warm, and he pulled her up with surprising ease, settling her to sit sideways behind him. The proximity was unnerving. She was pressed against the back of a man she had known for less than an hour. A man whose language and customs were a complete mystery to her. She could smell the faint, clean scent of wood smoke and leather that clung to him. As they left, the last flickering lights of the town behind the vastness of the prairie opened up before them, a sea of whispering grass under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. In Ohio, the night was filled with the familiar chorus of crickets and frogs. Here the silence was a living thing, broken only by the rhythmic plodding of the horse's hooves and the sigh of the wind. It was a silence that amplified her fear, her uncertainty. Had she made a catastrophic mistake, they rode for what felt like hours. The landscape, featureless and dark, offered no clues as to their destination. Chayton did not speak, his back a rigid wall in front of her. She fought the urge to ask questions. Where are we going? What will happen to me, knowing instinctively that he would not answer until he was ready. This was his world, and she was entering it on his terms. Finally, she saw the dark silhouette of a small structure against the star-dusted horizon. It was not the tipi she might have imagined, but a small, solid cabin, built of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud. A thin tendril of smoke curled from a stone chimney, indicating someone had recently tended a fire. Chayton dismounted and helped her down. Her legs were stiff and clumsy. He led the horse to a small lean-to corral before turning to the cabin. He pushed open the heavy plank door and gestured for her to enter. The interior was a single room, larger than she expected, and scrupulously clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire casting flickering shadows. A simple wooden table and 2 stools stood in the center. In one corner was a bed frame, neatly made with thick furs and wool blankets. In the other shelves held a few tin plates, a cast-iron pot, and neatly stacked provisions. It was a sparse, masculine space, yet it felt more like a home than any place she had seen that day. An old woman sat on a stool by the fire. Her face was a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, her white hair held in 2 neat braids. She looked up as they entered her dark eyes, sharp and intelligent. She looked from Chayton to Arya, her gaze lingering on Arya's face and her unfamiliar dress. Chayton spoke to her in a language that was all soft consonants and flowing vowels, a sound like water rushing over stones. The old woman listened, her expression unchanging. When he finished, she looked at Arya again, a long, appraising stare. Then she gave a slow, deliberate nod. "This is my Aunt Peter," Chayton said to Arya. "She keeps my home when I am away. She will show you things." Peter rose stiffly and gestured for Arya to sit at the table. She ladled a thick, savory-smelling stew into a tin bowl and placed it before her, along with a piece of dense, dark bread. It was the first offer of food Arya hadn't been too proud or distraught to accept. She ate ravenously, the warm stew a balm to her frayed nerves. Chaitan and Peter spoke quietly by the fire. Arya could not understand their words, but she felt she was the subject of their conversation. She felt Peter's eyes on her, not with malice, but with deep, penetrating curiosity. After Arya had finished eating, Peter took her bowl, then pointed to a small basin of water and a piece of lye soap. It was a clear, unspoken command. Arya washed her face and hands the cool water, a small baptism into this new life. When it was time to sleep, a new wave of anxiety washed over her. There was only one bed. Peter took a blanket and settled herself by the hearth without a word, her back to them. Chaitan gestured toward the bed. "It is your place," he said. And you?" She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He simply took another blanket and lay down on the hard, packed earth floor on the other side of the room, turning his back to her, as his aunt had done. He offered her privacy and respect when she had expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Brutality, perhaps. At the very least, a demand. Instead, he had given her food, shelter, and a space of her own. She lay down on the bed, the furs softer and warmer than any mattress she had ever known. She stared into the darkness, listening to the two alien sounds of the sleepers' breaths and the crackle of the dying fire. She was married. She was the wife of a Lakota warrior. She was in a cabin miles from any white settlement with two people whose language she did not speak. The sheer insanity of it all threatened to overwhelm her. Yet for the first time since stepping off that train, the cold knot of terror in her stomach had begun to loosen, replaced by a feeling so foreign she could hardly name it, a fragile, tentative sliver of safety. The days that followed were a lesson in a new kind of communication. Language was a barrier, but necessity was a universal translator. Peter, the old aunt, became Arya's silent tutor. She did not coddle or praise, she simply demonstrated. She showed Arya how to grind corn into meal using two smooth, heavy stones. She taught her which wild roots dug from the prairie soil were for stew and which were for medicine. She communicated with gestures, a sharp nod for a task done correctly, a dismissive wave of the hand for a mistake, a pointed finger to direct Arya's attention. Arya, who had always prided herself on her diligence, became a rapt student. She learned to scrape and treat a rabbit, hide her stomach, churning at first, until the practical need for warm gloves overcame her revulsion. She learned the rhythm of this life, rising with the sun, the quiet industry of the day, the shared meal in the evening. Chaitan was often gone for long stretches, disappearing into the prairie at dawn, with only a knife and a water skin, returning at dusk with a brace of prairie chickens, or once a small deer slung over his shoulders. He spoke little, but Arya began to learn him through his actions. She saw the gentleness with which he treated his horse, the focused intensity with which he sharpened his tools, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, reading the landscape like a book she couldn't even begin to open. One afternoon, while mending one of Chaitan's shirts, a simple garment of coarse-spun cotton he must have traded for, she pricked her finger badly. A single drop of blood welled up and stained the cloth. She gasped, frustrated. Chaitan, who had been oiling a rifle in the corner, looked up. He rose, walked over, and took her hand. His fingers were calloused and strong, yet his touch was surprisingly gentle. He examined the small wound, then went outside, returning a moment later with a crushed green leaf. He pressed the poultice to her finger, and the stinging pain immediately began to subside. He met her eyes for a brief second, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze, and then returned to his work without a word. That small act of care resonated more deeply with Arya than 100 pretty compliments would have. It was practical. It was real. In return, she sought ways to bridge the gap between their worlds. She took his worn shirts, and using the thread from the hem of her own ruined traveling dress, she reinforced the seams and tightened the buttons. She used her knowledge of baking to adapt, creating a denser, more flavorful version of the flatbread Peta made over the fire. One evening she served it with the stew. Chaitan ate his piece, then another, and gave her a single affirmative nod. For Arya, it was a triumph. She began to see the beauty in this harsh land. She learned to distinguish the different calls of the birds, to notice the subtle shift in the color of the grass that signaled a change in weather. This place was not empty, as she had first thought. It was teeming with a life she had simply been blind to. The first snow came early, a light dusting that melted by noon, but served as a stark warning. The prairie winter was not a thing to be taken lightly. Chaitan began spending his days hunting with a new urgency, smoking the meat and hanging it in strips from the cabin rafters. Peta and Arya gathered firewood until they had a stack as high as the cabin itself. They were a team working toward a common goal: survival. One evening, as a bitter wind howled outside, the three of them sat by the fire. The cabin was warm and filled with the smell of roasting meat. Peter was humming a low, ancient-sounding melody. Chaitan was carving a piece of wood into the shape of a small bird. Arya watched them, a strange sense of peace settling over her. She was no longer Arya Hobbs, the abandoned spinster from Ohio. She was a woman who knew how to find water, how to set a snare, how to make a home in the middle of nowhere. Chaitan finished his carving. He polished the small wooden bird with a piece of leather until it shone in the firelight. Then he leaned forward and placed it on the table in front of her. It was a gift, a simple, beautiful thing he had made with his own hands. She picked it up, its smooth surface warm against her palm. "Thank you," she whispered, looking at him. For the first time since she had met him, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. "It is a wren," he said softly. "They are strong. They build good nests." It was the most he had ever said to her at one time. In his words, she understood his meaning perfectly. He was not just speaking of the bird. He was speaking of her. He saw her strength, her resilience, her ability to make a home. In that moment, sitting in a rough-hewn cabin with a Lakota warrior and his aunt, Arya, felt more seen, more valued than she ever had in her entire life. This strange, silent man was her husband. This wild, unforgiving land was her home. And for the first time, it felt true. The deep winter settled in a vast and silent blanket of white. Life in the cabin fell into a peaceful, monotonous rhythm. The world shrank to the 4 log walls, the warmth of the fire, and the company of the 2 people who were now her family. Arya had found a strange contentment in this shrunken world. The memory of her humiliation at the train station had begun to fade, a scar that no longer pained her to the touch. The thaw came in late March, a slow, muddy affair that turned the prairie into a temporary swamp. It was during this time that Chaitan began to grow restless. He would stand outside the cabin for hours, staring south toward the distant line of hills that separated their lands from the encroaching white settlements. A tension settled back into his shoulders that had been absent during the winter months. One afternoon, a rider approached from the south. It was not a sight they were used to. Chaitan met the man 100 yards from the cabin, his hand resting casually on the knife at his belt. The visitor was another Lakota, a man named Tashunka, or his horse, from a neighboring camp. They spoke for a long time, their voices low and serious. Arya watched from the doorway, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. When Tashunka finally wheeled his horse around and rode off, Chaitan returned to the cabin, his face like a stone mask. "What is it?" Arya asked, her voice quiet. "News. From the town," he said, avoiding her eyes. "The rancher. Jedediah Stone." Arya felt a cold dread creep up her spine. She hadn't said that name, hadn't even thought it in months. "What about him?" she pressed. "His new wife." Chaitan said, his voice flat. "The one he sent for after you. She was small and pretty. She did not survive the winter." Arya was stunned into silence. She felt a brief, uncharitable flash of grim satisfaction, followed immediately by a wave of guilt and pity for the unknown woman. "Now," Chaitan continued, finally meeting her gaze, his eyes dark with warning. "He is alone again. And he has been talking in the saloon. He says an Indian stole his property. He says the law is on his side." The fragile piece of their world shattered. The ghost she thought she had laid to rest had returned. "He can't," Arya whispered. "I'm your wife. We're married." "In our way," Chaitan corrected gently. "Not in his. To Sheriff Brody, you are a white woman living with an Indian. You are not my wife. You are a problem." The fear that she had managed to conquer over the long winter months came flooding back, colder and more potent than before. The world outside their small patch of land had not forgotten them. It had been waiting, biding its time. A week passed in a state of suspended anxiety. Every shadow on the horizon looked like a rider. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Peter began a series of quiet chants, burning sage in the corners of the cabin in a ritual of protection. Chaitan spent his time cleaning his rifle, a model 1873 Winchester, checking his ammunition and sharpening his knives. He was not preparing for a hunt. He was preparing for a war. The confrontation came on a bright, clear morning. Arya was outside, hanging blankets to air in the spring sunshine, when she saw them, a posse of 4 riders cresting the nearest hill. She recognized Sheriff Brody's lanky frame immediately, and beside him on a large bay horse was the man whose face was burned into her memory. Jedediah Stone. Her heart leaped into her throat. She ran inside the cabin. "They're here!" she choked out. Chaitan was already standing, the Winchester held loosely in his hands. Peter stood by the fire, her face impassive, but her eyes held a fierce, protective glint. "Stay inside," Chaitan commanded Arya. He walked out the door, standing on the small patch of bare earth in front of it, a lone, defiant figure against the vastness of the prairie. He did not raise the rifle, but held it at his side, a clear statement that he was not the aggressor, but he was prepared. The posse reined in their horses about 20 yards from the cabin. Sheriff Brody dismounted, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Jedediah Stone remained on his horse, a cruel smirk playing on his lips, as his eyes fell on Arya, who was now watching, terrified, from the cabin doorway. Hawk Sheriff Brody called out, his voice carrying an official, strained tone. "We're not here for trouble. We're here for the woman. Her name is Arya." Chaitan's voice rang out, clear and steady. "She is my wife. She is home." "That's where you're wrong," Jedediah Stone interjected, his voice dripping with venom. "She's my property. I paid her passage. She broke a contract. I've come to collect what's mine." He looked directly at Arya, his eyes filled with a possessive, chilling light. "You've had your little adventure in the wilderness, Arya. It's time to come back to civilization." The prairie air, so clean and fresh, moments before, suddenly felt thick and heavy with menace. Sheriff Brody took a cautious step forward, his eyes flicking from Chaitan's impassive face to the Winchester he held so casually. "Now let's be reasonable," Brodie said, trying to sound authoritative. "There's a legal matter here. Mr. Stone filed a formal complaint. Breach of contract. He's got the letters, the receipt for the train fare. According to the law, you had an agreement." He directed his words at Arya, who stood frozen in the doorway. "This arrangement you have here isn't a recognized marriage. You have to come with us." Jedediah Stone leaned forward in his saddle, his smirk widening. "He's right, Arya. You belong to me. I was willing to overlook your shortcomings and take you back. A man can be forgiving, but you'll have to work off the debt you owe me for the trouble you've caused." His tone was sickly sweet, but the threat underneath was clear. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a slave. He wanted to punish her for the public humiliation he felt she had caused him. It was in that moment that something inside Arya snapped. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but something else rose to meet it, a hot, righteous fury. She thought of the months of peace, the quiet dignity of her life with Chaitan. She thought of the wooden wren, the gentle way he had tended her pricked finger, the shared understanding that had grown in the silence. She thought of the life Jedediah was offering, a life of servitude and daily humiliation, a constant reminder of her perceived flaws. She had been judged and found wanting on a train platform. She would not be judged and found wanting in her own home. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped out of the cabin and walked to stand beside Chaitan. She felt his surprise, a slight tensing of the muscles in his arm, but he did not look down at her. They stood together, a united front. "I am not your property, Mr. Stone," Arya said, her voice shaking, but carrying a new, unwavering strength. It was the first time she had spoken, and all eyes turned to her. "You rejected me. You publicly shamed me, and abandoned me with nothing. Any contract we had you voided on that platform." "That's for a judge to decide," Brodie grumbled, clearly uncomfortable. "Then let me tell the judge what kind of man Mr. Stone is." Arya continued, her voice rising in volume and confidence. She took a step forward, directly addressing the sheriff, but her eyes were locked on Jedediah. "He didn't just write to me. His first letters were to another woman from my town, a prettier girl named Sarah Peterson. She turned him down. He wrote to me as a second choice. He wrote about wanting a submissive and unquestioning wife. He described his first wife, who died in childbirth, as weak. He is a cruel, vain man who sees women as livestock. Is that the law you're here to uphold?" Sheriff, the right of a man to claim a horse, he decided he didn't want. Jedediah's face turned a mottled shade of red. "Lies. She's a hysterical lying." "I have the letters." Arya cut him off, her voice ringing with truth. "I kept them. Every last one. They are in my valise. They tell the whole story." This was a blow Brodie hadn't expected. A woman's word was one thing. Written proof was another. His certainty began to waver. He looked from Arya's defiant face to Jedediah's sputtering rage. Chaitan, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension like a razor. "The white man's law is a tangled net," he said, his gaze fixed on Brodie. "You come to my home with guns to enforce a piece of paper for a man who has no honor. This woman chose to stay here. This is her home now. If you try to take her, you are not lawmen. You are kidnappers, and you will be treated as such." He didn't raise the rifle, but his grip tightened, the meaning unmistakable. The two other men in the posse Simple farm hands roped into the sheriff's business shifted nervously in their saddles, looking at each other. This was not what they had signed up for. Sheriff Brody was caught. On one side was a vindictive and now potentially pejorious rancher. On the other was a determined Lakota man and a white woman who was articulate, defiant, and claimed to have evidence. Forcing the issue would lead to bloodshed, he was certain of that. And he wasn't sure a jury would convict a woman for defending herself or an Indian for defending his home, especially with Stone's character now in question. He chewed on his mustache for a long moment, the silence stretching taut. Finally he spat on the ground. "This ain't over," he muttered, but his words lacked conviction. He turned to Jedediah. "Let's go, Stone. We'll sort this out in town." "You're just going to leave her here?" Jedediah shrieked, his voice cracking with fury. "With him. Right now, it seems she's got more of a claim to being here than you have to taking her." Brody snapped, his patience gone. "Now get before this gets worse." Jedediah shot Arya a look of pure hatred, a look that promised future trouble. But he was powerless. He yanked on his horse's reins, wheeling the animal around violently, and galloped away his posse, following in a cloud of dust and defeat. Sheriff Brody was the last to leave. He lingered for a moment, looking at the two of them, the tall Lakota warrior and the big, sturdy white woman who stood beside him unflinching. He shook his head, a look of grudging, confused respect in his eyes. He mounted his horse and rode away without another word. They stood there, Arya and Chayton, side by side, until the riders were nothing more than specks on the horizon. The vast silence of the prairie returned, but this time it was a silence of peace, of victory. Arya let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, her legs, suddenly feeling weak. She looked up at Chayton. He was already looking at her, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen before. It was not pity, not assessment, not even just respect. It was wonder. "You have the heart of a warrior, Arya Hobbs," he said softly. "I am Arya Chayton." She corrected him, her voice quiet but firm. "And I was just protecting my home." He reached out, not to take her arm or her hand, but to gently brush a stray lock of hair from her face. It was the most intimate gesture he had ever made. In that single touch, a new understanding passed between them, one that had nothing to do with contracts or convenience, and everything to do with a bond forged in defiance and sealed in courage. The departure of the posse did not leave a triumphant cheer in its wake, but a profound and heavy silence. The vast emptiness of the prairie rushed back in to fill the space where the men's threats had been. Arya and Chayton stood for a long time side by side, watching the dust settle on the horizon. The adrenaline that had sharpened Arya's voice and straightened her spine now drained away, leaving her trembling, her legs feeling as weak as a newborn colt's. She looked up at Chayton. He was already looking at her, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen before. It was not pity, not a practical assessment, and not even just respect. It was a deep, soul-stirring wonder, as if he were seeing her for the first time. "You have the heart of a warrior, Arya Hobbs," he said, his voice imbued with a quiet awe. A small, weary smile touched her lips. "I am Arya Chayton," she corrected him, the name feeling solid and true on her tongue for the first time. "And I was just protecting my home." He reached out, not to take her arm or her hand, but to gently brush a stray lock of hair from her face, his calloused thumb tracing a path along her cheekbone. It was the most intimate gesture he had ever made, a silent acknowledgement that shattered the last remaining wall of formality between them. In that single touch, a new understanding passed between them, one that had nothing to do with contracts or convenience, and everything to do with a bond forged in defiance and sealed in courage. That evening, the mood inside the cabin was transformed. Peter, who had watched the entire confrontation from the doorway with the stillness of a hawk, hummed a low, triumphant melody as she stirred the stew. When they sat to eat, the usual silence felt different. It was no longer a space of awkwardness, but one of shared gravity. After they had eaten, Chaitan looked across the table at Arya, the firelight carving deep shadows on his face. "You were not afraid," he stated. "It wasn't a question." "I was terrified," Arya confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "My hands are still shaking, but my fear of him, of what he would do, it was less than my fear of losing this." She gestured vaguely at the cabin, the fire, the life they had begun to build. "Back in Ohio, I was taught a woman's place was to be quiet, to be agreeable. Today I found my voice. I think it has been waiting for me out here in all this quiet." Chaitan considered her words for a long moment. "A voice is a powerful weapon," he said. "Today yours was sharper than any knife. You spoke the truth and it cut him down." He paused, his gaze intense. "I would have fought for you. I would have died for you today. But you fought for us." The distinction was everything. It shifted the foundation of their arrangement from one of protection to one of partnership. They were equals defending their shared territory. That night when they went to sleep, Chaitan did not unroll his bedroll on the floor. He hesitated for a moment, then laid it on the floor beside the bed where she slept. He did not try to join her, but the message of his proximity was clear. He was no longer just her shield. He was her partner, her guard, her husband, in a way that no lawman or preacher could ever sanctify or deny. The seasons turned. The brutal Dakota summer gave way to a crisp autumn, and the threat of winter once again spurred them into a flurry of preparation. It was during a late-season hunt that disaster struck. Chaitan was caught in a sudden freezing rainstorm miles from the cabin. He returned near midnight, drenched and shivering, leading his horse behind him. By morning he was consumed by a fever, his breathing a shallow, rattling gasp. Peter's face was grim as she felt his forehead. "His lungs are full of water," she said, her Lakota words, translated by a few simple, universal gestures of dread. It was lung fever, the same sickness that could take a strong man in a matter of days. Arya's terror returned, but it was a different kind of fear now. It was not for herself, but for him. Peter Wise in the ways of herbs was old, and her hands shook. She could direct, but the real work fell to Arya. For 3 days and 3 nights, she did not leave his side. She brewed the bitter teas Peter instructed her to make from willow bark and steeped roots, forcing the concoctions between his cracked lips. She kept the fire roaring, turning the cabin into a sweat lodge. When his shivering became violent, she lay beside him, covering his body with her own, trying to force her warmth into his chilled bones. In his delirium he spoke in his own language, crying out names she did not know. He was vulnerable, stripped of his stoic strength, and in his weakness, Arya's heart broke open. This silent, formidable man who had saved her was now completely dependent on her. She bathed his face with cool water, spoke to him in soft, soothing tones, and prayed to a god she hoped was listening in this wild land. She was no longer just his wife. She was his anchor to the living world. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. He awoke weak and drenched in sweat, but his eyes were clear. He looked at her truly, seeing her exhaustion, her tear-streaked face, the fierce devotion in her eyes. "Arya," he rasped, his voice raw. "I'm here," she whispered, taking his hand. "I'm here, Chaitan." His recovery was slow, binding him to the cabin for weeks. That time, a crucible of fear and care, became the true heart of their marriage. With nothing to do but heal, he began to talk. He told her stories of his childhood, of learning to track with his father. He explained the meaning of the symbols on his shield, the history of his people, the sorrow for the life that had been lost. In return, she read to him from her book of sonnets. "That man's words," he said one afternoon after she'd read, "shall I compare thee to a summer's day? They are like intricate beadwork, beautiful, but I do not understand their pattern." "It's about love," she explained softly, "about how love and a person's memory can outlast death." He looked at her, a deep understanding dawning in his eyes. "Our storytellers say the same," he said. "They say a person is not truly gone until their name is spoken for the last time. Your book, it keeps those people alive." He then taught her the names of his ancestors, speaking them aloud, so that they might live in the warmth of their cabin. She taught him to write his name in English, his large, strong hand painstakingly forming the letters. They were no longer two separate worlds living in the same space. They were weaving their lives, their histories and their futures into a single, resilient tapestry. Years passed. Peter passed away peacefully in her sleep one winter, and they buried her on a high bluff overlooking the creek, honoring her in the Lakota way. Arya, who once would have found the rituals foreign and frightening, now participated with a full and grieving heart, her voice joining Chaitan's in the songs to the ancestors. Their home became a testament to their union. The garden expanded a neat rectangle of Ohioan order in the wild prairie grass. A sturdy new corral stood beside the cabin, built from logs Chaitan had felled, and Arya had helped him strip and place. Inside shelves held not only clay pots and baskets made by Peter, but also Arya's preserves in sealed glass jars, a splash of color against the dark wood. They were a strange, respected legend in the territory. Other Lakota families who had at first been wary of Chaitan's white wife came to call her Wingyan Tanka, big woman. It was the same description Jedediah Stone had used as an insult, but from them it was a name of honor, a recognition of her strength, her courage, and her immense heart. Sometimes a lone traveler or a lost missionary would stumble upon the cabin and be taken aback by the sight of them. An Indian warrior, speaking quietly with a plain-faced white woman, moving around each other, with the easy, unspoken grace of two people who were two halves of a whole. They offered hospitality to all who came in peace, sharing a meal and a warm fire before sending them on their way, leaving the visitors to marvel at the impossible life they had built. One cool summer evening, many years after that fateful day at the station, Arya and Chaitan sat outside their home on a bench he had built for her. They were no longer young. Grey streaked her brown hair, and his face was a road map of deeper lines. They watched the sunset, painting the sky in the same violent, beautiful streaks of orange and purple as it had on the day they met. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly, her gaze on the horizon. "Leaving your world for this?" He was silent for a long time, not because he was searching for an answer, but because he was feeling the weight of it. He reached over and took her hand, his palm calloused and familiar against hers. "I did not leave my world," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You became my world?" She leaned her head on his shoulder, a comfortable, practiced gesture. The life she had was nothing like the one she had prayed for on that train. It was harder, wilder, and more uncertain. But it was real. It was a life of profound respect, of shared strength, and of a quiet, enduring love as steady and vast as the land itself. They had been brought together by a cruel man and a broken promise, but in the end, in the home they had built, and the life they had forged, they had kept the only promise that ever truly mattered, the unspoken promise to see, to honor, and to cherish the discarded heart of another. The story of Aurea and Chaitan isn't found in any official records. It's a story written on the wind, etched into the memory of the prairie itself. It reminds us that strength isn't always loud, and that family can be forged in the most unexpected of fires. They were two people society deemed too much and not enough. Yet together, they found a balance that made them whole. Their legacy is a powerful testament to the idea that our true worth is never determined by the people who refuse to see it, but by the courage with which we build a life of our own choosing. If their story of resilience and unlikely love moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button and share it with someone who might appreciate a tale from the forgotten corners of the Wild West. And for more stories like this, stories of the unsung heroes and the quiet legends of our past, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Thank you for listening.